Hi everyone, this is Module 5, Unit 5, and this is an introduction to what we call CAQDAS, or Computer Assisted Qualitative Data Analysis Software. So we hope after listening to this module, you'll be able to name some key considerations in doing qualitative data analysis, namely coding, memoing, theme identification, or meaning making. We hope you'll be able to describe how computer-assisted qualitative data analysis can support your data analysis processes, and you'd be able to name and demonstrate some basic features of Dedoose, which is one kind of qualitative data analysis software. So before we get started, I want to just remind us about the steps of qualitative data analysis. We have a qualitative data analysis 1 module, but since we're going to be talking about software, I want to just ground us in how you do qualitative data analysis. And the reason is because even though we have software systems to help us organize the data, you as a qualitative data analyst actually still does all of the work. So I just want to make that clear. So once we have the data, again, qualitative data can be textual, it can be visual, it can be audio data. We organize the data, we clean it so it's ready for analysis, so prepare it in similar ways you would quantitative. We code the data to try to make sense of it. We memo, which is a reflective process where we reflect on what we're seeing in the data. And then we do analysis of code. So we look at code relationships. And from there, we should be able to identify themes within the data or come up with other kinds of meaning. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So what I want to do in this review is review the analytical process of qualitative research, comparing it to what students are more familiar with, which is quantitative. Remind you of what is coding, what is memoing, what is theme development, or theme identification, and then introduce one kind of qualitative data analysis software, which is Dedoose. So qualitative analysis is the non-mathematical process of interpretation carried out for the purpose of discovering concepts and relationships in the raw data, and then organizing these into some kind of theoretical explanatory scheme. And some important components of this definition is that it is non-mathematical. This is the analysis of things that are not numbers, and you're doing this in order to find meaning, so coming up with some kind of way of identifying what you have here. This analogy I really like from Saldana talks about what we're interested in is symbolic summaries of meaning. So in quantitative research and quantitative data analysis, our symbolic summaries of meaning are numerical. So 87%, 9 out of 10, 63 years old. These are representations of meaning. In qualitative research, codes which are language-based symbolic summaries of textual or visual data. So our codes are word-based, language-based, textual narrative, but similarly, they are representing larger meaning. So if 87% represents larger meaning in quant data, a code like distrust, it represents more meaning in the data. So we use words and phrases rather than numbers to summarize and symbolize the data's meaning. Qualitative and quantitative procedures are similar in that you move from preparation of the data to validating the meaning of the data. And we walked through this in the first module, but it's important to know the steps of qualitative data analysis. People move very quickly from the production of data to the identification of meaning without thinking about the systematic analytical processes. So in qualitative data, we organize the data for analysis. We become very familiar with the data, so we read, or listen. We memo, which is keeping a record of the analyst's reflection on the meaning of the data. We can develop a codebook, and a codebook is similar to a codebook we might create in quantitative research where we have codes that we then apply to the data. After we apply the codes to the data, we can identify emerging themes or meaning. When we represent the meaning of the data, because the meaning is in words, this might be narrative description, so paragraphs. We might be able to come up with a visual model to describe the meaning. And then when we interpret and validate, we interpret meaning by explaining how findings relate to the research question, but because a qualitative researcher can be inside and close to one's data, we can also provide personal meaning about the data. And when we move to the stage of validation, we're actually more interested in trustworthiness of the data than if they're valid. We want to know that members of the community from which the data will come trust that the findings are true. So I want to go over just some some qualitative data analysis definitions. So a code is a word or a set of words that categorize or make segments of data with short names. So coding is categorizing or marking segments, I should say. Memoing is stopping and capturing your ideas about code or theme development in any and every way that occurs to you. And themes are things that emerge from the codes. This is some language we use in qualitative data analysis. So we're typically interested in codes and coding, and we tend to code selected text. So this is an excerpt or text segment, the second definition here. When we develop codes, we can create a code book with definitions, with inclusion and exclusion criteria. There can be different kinds of coding. We memo by stopping and capturing our ideas. These are analytic reflections during the coding process. And then here's some other language that you'll hear about later in this module and others. We can create codes that were a priori, so they were determined before we began analysis, or we can have codes emerge as part of the memoing process. We'll talk more about that later. While qualitative and quantitative are very similar in the stages of analysis that you move through, qualitative data analysis is actually much more cyclical, and you can move forward and backward as needed in the data. So that's what distinguishes it from quantitative. There's some approaches there's lots of different approaches to coding. Your approaches to coding should match your epistemological and theoretical lens approach stance with respect to the data. Typically, coding is at least two levels, one a little bit more initial and one more focused, and it's often a staged approach where you move, they're staged, but you can move back and forth between the coding types. These are some coding types I use and my students use in our coding and analysis, usually an initial code and then a focused higher level, more theoretical code. Initial meaning kind of your first insights or a descriptive nature of the meaning of the data. And then we use a code called Great Quotes, which is really a selection of text that you know captures something very important in the data that you might want to put in a manuscript or in a community presentation. And in vivo codes are codes that actually emerge from the participants themselves. So someone might say something in just a particular way that those words that they use become a code in and of themselves. So some tips to coding. This comes from, well, Sharma, Saldana, Corbin, and Strauss. Lots of people have tips for coding. It's a very iterative, very personal process, and the tips are to become very involved in the data, learn from the data. Sharma talks about theoretical playfulness, so meaning being open to what you see, being able to move from concrete events and discussions to more theoretical insight. And Corbin and Strauss recommend asking a lot of questions to the process. Kind of the questions can help move you forward. So in developing a code book, I want to show you an example of a couple code books. When necessary, when it fits your research and fits your method, a priori codes make a lot of sense. You can have some codes that you know in the data you're going to be looking for because they're tied to your research question or they're aligned with your focus group guide. If you're doing more grounded theory, you may have no a priori codes because you want the codes to really emerge from the data through the memoing process. But ideally, a code book evolves as you go through the process. And computer-assisted qualitative data analysis can keep track of the changes to the codes and the code relationships. You want to have clear definitions. I often export my code book to Excel and then have a record of it and can play around it. And I'll show you some examples of codes in the CAQDAS I'm going to show you. Here's an example of a code book. You often have a parent code and some child codes. These are some codes from a work study where we have a study on precarious work, where we have code definitions, we have inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, and example. And then we keep track of how it emerged because in this research we had some a priori codes, but some that emerged from debriefing processes because it was participatory research. We engaged in listening to the data with our community research partners and came up with more inductive codes that way. Here's some tactics to make sense of the data. Once you have everything coded, you start trying to make sense or make meaning or identify meaning in the data. And so some of the ways to do this are to think about, once everything is coded, now what goes with what? What's really here? How do I have a sharpened understanding now that everything's coded? Sharmaz talks about creating a skeleton of your data, and with that, by coding, and with that coded skeleton, sometimes things can just emerge more clearly. You can try to differentiate meaning in the data. You can look for relationships, sub-relationships, and you can build theory. So there's lots of different ways, and CAQDAS allows you to look at the data in all sorts of ways. Similarly, we can look at the relationships between codes or code patterns. You can look at some similarities. What are some things happening in the same way? Or differences in code relationships, or something happen in predictably different ways. You can look at issues of frequency or sequence. So when you're coding the data, how frequent are codes being used, or are they happening in a particular order? Are you coding things in a particular order, meaning there's some relationship among codes that co-occur or occur right after each other? Are there some correspondences in the codes? They happen to be in relation to other activities. Or is there causation? So that's a loose use of the word causation because the data is not set up to test for causation. I want to really quickly go through 3 analytic approaches. There's some other modules on different ways to do analysis, but I want you to know that there isn't one way, and the way that you do analysis is important to articulate because you will code the data differently. So I'm going to talk about directed content analysis, grounded theory, and phenomenology. So with directed content analysis, this tends to begin with a conceptual framework for structuring the analysis. It utilizes a more deductive approach to explore the textual data for insights. And it has particular utility in research areas where current theory or previous evidence needs further elucidation. So you're actually directing your analysis. You're looking at the content directly to see what's happening here, what's emerging. And distinguishing this from grounded theory, which is a more systematic, which is an approach to research in which you're grounding your insight in the data. It's really good for developing theory. That you come into this kind of analysis with no a priori assumptions, so you really set aside what you know, what you think, what you might assume about this. And this kind of coding can be really good also when you know nothing about what's going on. So this is a kind of analysis approach, I should say. You can code in different ways. Phenomenology, and you'll hear more about this in another module, is another approach to the analysis where you're interested in a lived experience of a phenomena. There's real emphasis on the experience itself. It investigates what and how things are being experienced. And a good approach to coding for a phenomenological analysis is to use gerund codings or words with ing, where you're really looking for something happening, some experience. So I'm going to show you a little bit about Dedoose. So I'm going to share my desktop, and then I'm coming back to the slides. So let's see if this works. Okay. So this is Dedoose. There are lots of different ways to do. There's lots of different kinds of CAQDAS, so qualitative data analysis software systems. Atlas TI is also one at UIC that you have access to. So this is what Dedoose looks like. This is one data set in Dedoose that I just wanted to show you for some examples. And I want to define some of the things we talked about. So over here are the codes. Here's an example of both a parent code and a child code with the definitions embedded. If we were to, this is from a study I did on bladder issues. If we click on the code, we'll go directly to what we call the text excerpts. So this is the narrative data, the 2-3 sentences that might be selected to be coded. Up here is the actual data itself. So this is both the transcribed verbatim focus group data, but also the field notes, because the field notes are very important to us to make sure the meaning that we see in the focus groups is trustworthy. Down here is really a descriptor of what we have here, the focus group by type and by age. And if we click on these tabs over here, I can show you some ways in which after the data are all coded, you can find some, the analysis code. You can find some ways to look at the relationship between codes. We can look at a code cloud, which basically shows the size of the word. The bigger the size, the more often it's coded. So that's one way of kind of visually seeing what you have. I'm going to post to Blackboard all sorts of videos from Dedoose that show you all the other things that you can do with looking at code patterns. One of the things that's very useful to me is to look at co-occurrence. So when codes occur with other codes across the focus group, this can be really useful to understand what you have in the data. So this is a code that co-occurs 11 times with other codes. I think that's all I want to show you in Dedoose. So this is just one project, but I could show you another. These are all the coding projects that I have. I wanted to show this one. This might be it. I want to show you in this media window. This is an example in which a different kind of data is being analyzed. So I said before in one of the modules, and you might find that the oral data is more useful than textual data. Often you lose something when you move from audio to text. So in this case, we actually coded the data in audio form. And so that's something you can do in Dedoose, and you can do in Atlas TI. And down here, you'll see descriptors of what the different focus groups were. So I'm going to go back to my, here we go, to Dedoose. I only have a couple more slides. So Dedoose is one kind of qualitative data analysis software. There's lots that you can use. What you're basically doing after is organizing the data, coding it, and then you're able to kind of use the relationships across the code, some of the analytic features to really tell you what's going on in the data. One of the important things that outside of storing, organizing, and analyzing your data that software programs can do is a network analysis. Here it is. And that can help you look at the relationships between your codes. So those arrows meaning distinguishing something different about these codes. So these codes all have to do with issues of fear of deportation, repercussions of unknown impact and help seeking. These codes all have to do with residents, the neighborhood as an immigration portal, and both of these sub-themes have to do with the impact of immigration on community health. So being able to kind of visually see how these fit together and see these numbers refer to how often this code was coded and how often it co-occurred with other codes. So qualitative data analysis helps you work to analytically reduce your data. It helps you produce summaries of the meaning in the data. It can help you display the data to help you make meaning. And the important thing to remember is analysis is an iterative and evolutionary thing. You know you finally have identified meaning in the data when you feel like your data has reached saturation and you can clearly articulate the meaning in the data. And these are my references. And so that's all for this module, and you can go to the quiz to understand more about this. Thanks so much.